Welcome back. Let's now talk about our first data structure, and that's going to be arrays. And let's say I wanted to store my friends' names in variables so that I could use them later in my program. And so with the knowledge that we have so far, this is how we would do it. So const friend1, let's say Michael. Let's spell this correct. Then friend2 Stephen, and then friend 3, let's say Peter. Now, this isn't really fun to do, right? Because imagine that we actually wanted to represent 10 friends, and then we would have to create 10 variables. So that doesn't sound like fun. Instead, wouldn't it be great to essentially bundle all of these values together into some bigger container? Well, that's why we have data structures in JavaScript. And arrays are such a data structure. So an array is like a big container into which we can throw variables and then later reference them. And that's super important because programming is most of the time all about data. So we get data from somewhere, we store and process data, and then we give some data back. And that data, it has to go somewhere. So it has to be stored in some place. And for that, we use data structures just like arrays. So in case we have more than just a single value. The two most important data structures, at least in JavaScript, are arrays and objects. And so now let's learn all about arrays. So instead of doing this, let's create a variable which I'm going to call friends. And then we use the brackets to create a new array. And then in there, we can put different values separated by commas. And so let's now use the exact same friends. So Michael, comma, then Stephen, comma, and Peter. And make sure that these commas here are outside of the string. So that's an error I see people do. And so this needs to be one string. So you need to start and finish it, then the comma, and then another value, then another comma, and then another value. Okay, and now let's take a look at it in the console. Okay, and so this is what the array looks like in the console. So basically just as we wrote it in our code. And that is the absolute basics about arrays. So that's how we create one. At least that's the way that we use the most. But there's actually another way. So let me show that to you as well. So let's say we wanted an array of years. And so instead of the brackets, we could also write new array and then parentheses. And in there, we would then specify our values. Let's say 1991, 1984, 2008, and let's say 2020. So an array can hold as many values as we want, and also values of any type that we'd like. So it doesn't have to be strings like here. Of course, numbers work just the same. So here we used a different way of creating the array, which was using this array function. So you see that it's a function because we called it here, basically using these parentheses. And we also needed to use the new keyword, because otherwise it's not going to work. But anyway, it's way more usual to just use the brackets like I did up here, which is called the literal syntax. Great, so now we know how to create arrays, so basically how to put elements into an array, but of course we need to have a way to get them out. And for that we use the square bracket syntax again. So let's say that we want to log to the console the first element of this friends array. So that would be Michael. So console.log, and now we write friends. So that's the name of the array. And then we use the square brackets and then the number 0. That's because arrays are zero-based, which means that this first element is the element number 0, then this one is element number 1, number 2, and so on and so forth. And so if we want the element at position 0, so this first one, then we write friends, square brackets, 0. And that's it. And now let's say we wanted Peter here as well. So that would be element 0, 1, 2. And so let's just write 2. And check it out. And indeed, we get Michael and Peter. Cool. Now, we can also get the actual number of elements that is in the array. So let's also log that one to the console. And this one works by saying friends dot length. Okay? And this dot length is something called a property, which we're going to talk about a little bit later in this section when we talk about objects. Anyway, what matters is that this is going to be the exact amount of elements that is in the array. And it's not zero-based. So it will not be 2, even though the last one here is element number 2. Instead, it really gives us the number of elements in the array. So we should expect this to log 3. And yeah, here we go. Now we can use this to automatically get the last element of any array. And that is useful so that we don't have to count how many elements are in the array. So let me show you how we could do that. Friends, and then remember, to retrieve an element from the array, we need to square brackets. So just like this. And then to get the index of the last element in the array, all we need to do is friends.length minus 1. So friends.length minus 1. And that's because, again, friends.length is not zero-based. So this is 3, remember, but this last element is 2. And so we always need to subtract 1 from this number here. Okay? So what this also means is that inside of these brackets, we can put any expression. It doesn't just have to be a number, literally like we did here and here. So here we have this expression. And remember that an expression is something that produces a value. And so this one here is going to be calculated first. So it will compute friends.length, which is 3, minus 1 is 2, and then it will get friends at position 2. And that's also one of the reasons why it's important that you know what is an expression and what is a statement. Because once again, we could not put a statement in here. So inside of these square brackets, JavaScript expects an expression, not a statement. Anyway, we got the correct element from the array, which is the element number 2. And so that means that this automatic retrieval of the last element works just fine. All right. And moving on, there is more stuff that we can do. So this square brackets syntax that we used here is not only for retrieving elements from the array, but we can also change it to add elements to the array. So let's say that for some reason I'm no longer friends with Peter and that I want to replace him with some other friends. And so now we can change or mutate the array in the same way. So we can say friends at position number 2, and now I'm doing it manually here again. So we can say that this should be equal to something else. Let's say J. And if we now log this friends array to the console, then we should already see the new array. So friends, and let's see. And indeed, the element number 2, so this one here, is now replaced with J. Okay, so in the beginning, when we first logged the friends array to the console, it was still in this state. So it still had Peter. And that's why here in the beginning, we still see that original state. But then as we move on through the code, at some point here, we change that array. And so when we then log the array again, that change is of course reflected here in the output. But wait, didn't I say in the last section that variables declared with const cannot be changed? And we did in fact declare the friends variable here with const, right? But I was still able to change one element of the array here from Peter to J, right? So isn't that a contradiction? Well, what I didn't tell you at the time is that only primitive values are immutable. But an array is not a primitive value. And so we can actually always change it. So we can mutate it. And it works this way because of the way that JavaScript stores things in memory. And once more, we will have a whole lecture just on that topic alone in a special section about how JavaScript works behind the scenes. So what you need to know for now is that we can actually mutate arrays even though they were declared with const. Now what we cannot do is to actually replace the entire array. So we cannot do this. We cannot say that the entire friends array should now be Bob and Alice. That would be illegal. So let's see. And now we get assignment to constant variable. And so that's why that we cannot do. But let's just keep it here anyway, so you get this as a reference. Next up, I want to show you that an array can actually hold values with different types all at the same time. So let's experiment with that. So let's create an array which holds all kinds of information about me. So let's say Jonas, so that would be the first name, then the last name, then the age, and here we can actually calculate the age from other values. And that works because in each position, JavaScript simply expects an expression. And so if we do this, then this is perfectly fine. Okay, so this will here produce a value, and so that's the value that will then be stored at position number 2 of the new array. And that also works for variables. So we could, for example, do first name equal Jonas, and then here instead of literally writing that, we could use this variable name. And so this would then be replaced with the actual string. So let's put some more data. And actually, we could even put other arrays inside of an array. So that's really cool. So let's put the friends array here in the Jonas array. And then with this, we have all the relevant data about Jonas in one handy data structure. And that's really convenient because then we don't have to create one variable for each of the data points. So let's, of course, inspect this now in the console so that you can see that all of these expressions here, basically, so this and this here and this, so all of them are going to be replaced with the values that they produce. And so, indeed, we now get Jonas, we have the calculated age, and here we have the array 3. And we can expand that by clicking on this small triangle here, and then we can see the actual array in here. We also have the length, so length is 5, and so that's where JavaScript gets this friends.length from. Jonas.length would of course also work, and it would be this 5 that we see here. Okay, so that's the one. Great, so these are the very fundamentals of arrays in JavaScript. And now just to finish this video, let's work on a very small array exercise so that we can see why arrays are actually so useful. And to do that, let's bring back our old calc_h function. So it's gotta be somewhere here. Yes, let's use this one. We've coded this so many times that I don't want to repeat it. So exercise. So calc_h. And now let's say that we have an array of birth years. And then we want to calculate the ages for some of them. So a new array And let's say 1990, 1967, 2002, 2010, and 2018. And now we will be able to use the calc_age function and then store the results of calculating the ages for some of these years into a new array. So let's see how, and let's see first how we could not do it, okay? So, for example, if we wanted to use the calc_age function for all of the elements in this array, we could not do this. This would be not illegal, I would say, but it's not going to work because this years is an array. And if we pass this years array as an argument to the calc_age function, it doesn't know what to do with it because this operation here expects a single value, and we cannot do a number minus an array. So let me actually show you what's going to happen if we run this. And well, that's not the error that I wanted to show you. So what we get is identifier years has already been declared. So this means that somewhere in the code we already have an array called years. And yeah, here it is. So let's change the name of this one to just y. So that one doesn't really matter anyway. But now let's see what happens. And well, not much did happen. So we actually need to inspect the result of this. So console.log and then the result of this. So let's see. And now we get the result, not a number. And so that's the result of attempting to subtract a whole array, which would be this years array, from a number. Okay, so let's actually do that here as well. Remember that we have access to all the variables that we declare in the script, also in the console. So that's the years array that we just declared. But years, for example, plus 10, does not work. At least not in a way that we expected it. So the plus operator, what it does here is to convert everything to a string, just like I showed you before. And so the string here is then basically this array as a string, and then it adds the 10 here. So that's not meaningful at all. And if we use it with minus 10, then it's even weirder. So we get not a number. So all of this is to say that we cannot really do operations with arrays. But we can still use the calc_age function on individual elements of the array, of course. So let's do that. And we will assume that I want to calculate the ages for the first, the second, and the last array element. So this one, and this one. So let's calculate this and then store the result into a variable called age1. Then we need to get rid of this parenthesis. And so as I said, I want to calculate the age for this first element. And so what we do is to take years at position 0. And so this here will then basically be replaced with 1990. And then calc_age is called with 1990, and the result is stored to age1. Now let's do this some more times. And say age2, age3. And here I'm using 1. So remember, I want this, and the last one. But I don't want to count the number of elements in the array. And so I use that trick that I just showed you in the beginning, which is to first compute the length of the array. So years.length, and then -1 to account for the fact that the index of the array is 0-based. And now we can quickly check out if this actually worked. So age1, age2, age3. And yeah, so we got 3 values here, which are these 3 ages. But we can take this even a little bit further. So since we started with an array, it's usually a good idea to also end up with a new array. So let's create an array, const ages, And now what should I put in here? Well, remember how I said up here that any position of the array simply needs to be an expression, so something that produces a value. And as we already know, this here produces a value as well, right? It is an expression. And so I can take this and simply put it as a position in this array. And so JavaScript will then go ahead, compute this value, and place it in the array. So basically, we can place function calls into an array just fine because they will produce a value. And now here we need to again do years dot length minus 1. And now finally logging it to the console, and then we're done. And indeed, we get the 3 same values that we had up here separately, now all nicely placed into this array. And this of course works because JavaScript will start by running these function calls, these 3 function calls here, and then place all the results in an array afterwards. Nice. And I think that should be enough for one video. I hope that you see how fun arrays can be and how useful they can be. And in the next lecture, we will make them even more useful by doing some operations with them. JavaScript has some built-in functions that we can basically apply directly on arrays. And these are called methods, and we can think of methods as array operations, basically. So let's now learn some useful array methods. And there are actually countless array methods in JavaScript. And in fact, we have a whole section dedicated to arrays alone. That's how important they are in JavaScript. But in this video, we're going to learn just some basic ones that you really need to know. And also so that you start to get used to the idea of using methods on arrays. Now let's start by bringing back the friends array from the last lecture. All right. And now let's start with a method called push. So the push method adds elements to the end of an array. And so let's say friends dot and then push and then the element that we want to add to the end of the array. So let's say j here. So push is essentially a function, and we can see that by these parentheses. So it's a function that we call, and we call that function really attached to the friends array itself. And that's what this dot here stands for. All right. So again, push is a method, which technically is a function, and we call that function directly on the friends array. So the push function is kind of attached to the friends array. And if you're wondering why that is, we will once more learn that a little bit later in the course. But there is a good reason why this works, and it's actually pretty fascinating stuff. So I hope that you're excited to keep continuing to explore this course until you'll really learn how all of this actually works. Now, anyway, let's now check out the friends array in the console, because this is really all we need to do to add an element to the end of the array. And indeed, now we get the original array that we had before, plus the j element. And you see that the length is now also 4. Okay, so this actually changed, so it mutated the original array, but that's no problem at all, just like I explained you in the previous lecture. Remember that? All right. Now, since push is a function here, it can also return something. So we already know that we can pass arguments into functions, and we did that here with j. Then the function can do some work, and in this case, the work that the push function does is to add the element to the array, and actually the push function does return a value. And the value that it returns is the length of the new array. So if we want to capture that data or that value, we can create a new variable for that. So let's call it new length. And let's then also log it to console. And indeed, it is 4. So most of the time we actually don't do this. So we just push an element and call it a day, because usually we don't immediately need the length of the new array. But in case we need it, we don't need to then calculate it separately. We can simply take the result of this function here, store it into a variable, and then use that. Great. Now, besides the push method, which adds elements to the end of the array, there's also a method to add elements to the beginning of the array. So that is the unshift method. So unshift. And so let's say we wanted to add John right to the beginning of this friends array. So again, let's check it out. And so now it should have 5 elements, and the first one should be John. And yeah, it is. And just like the push method, the unshift method also returns the length of the new array. But in this case, we are just not saving it because we don't really need it. Next up, we also have methods to remove elements from arrays. So these one here, add elements. So let me just write that here. Add elements. And then we have some to remove elements. And let's start with the pop method, which is basically the opposite of the push method. So this means that pop will remove the last element of the array. So let's write that here. And this time we don't need to pass in any argument. And that's because there's no information needed really to just take out the last element. So let's try that. Oh, we didn't log it again to the console. So let's just grab it from here. And now you see that J is actually gone. And if we did it twice, for example, which of course we can also do, then Peter should also be gone. And indeed, we removed J and Peter. Now again, this pop method also returns something, but this one doesn't return the length of the new array, but instead it returns the removed element. And so that can sometimes be useful. So let's call this one popped, okay? And so let's log that one to the console as well. So that is the popped element. And we could do the same for this first call. But as I said earlier, we don't always do this because it's not always that useful. But here I just want to show you that it actually works. And so the popped element should now be Peter. So this first one here is J, and then the last one becomes Peter. And so here in the second pop call, Peter is the one that's being removed. And so that's the element that's then going to be saved into popped. And yeah, here it is. Okay. And finally, let's also remove the first element from the array. And so that's friends that unshift. So let's copy this one again. Give it a save. And so now only Michael and Steven should be left after all this manipulation, right? Oh, and actually that did not work. And that's because I did a mistake. So unshift is of course to add elements to the array. And so this one here is called shift and not unshift. So now it should work. Yeah. Once again, we didn't need any arguments. And once again, this method here will return the element that was removed. So if we need that, we can capture it. Next up, there is a very useful method that tells us in which position a certain element is in the array. So let's work with this small array that we have left. And what we want to log to the console now is friends.indexOf. And then we pass the element which we want to reference. So let's say we want Stephen. And so, as I said, this should return the index at which this element is located. So we know that Stephen is right now element number 1, right? So 0 and 1. And we actually can see that here in the console. So 0 is Michael, 1 is Stephen. And so this index of function call should return the value 1. Because again, that's the index of the element Stephen. And yeah, there we go. Now, if we try the same thing for an element that is not in there, let's say Bob, we will get -1. All right. And now finally, to finish this, this lecture, there is a very similar method to the index of, but which is a bit more modern and, in my opinion, also more useful. So this one is an ES6 method and it's called includes. So includes, instead of returning the index of the element, will simply return true if the element is in the array and false if it's not. So let's check that. So friends.includes, and now we can actually do the same as up here. So let me just copy that. And the difference here is, again, the includes method. So let's see what we get now. And as expected with Stephen, it is true, because indeed we have one element here, Stephen, but Bob is false because, well, there is no element called Bob. And this method actually uses strict equality for this check. So let's say that we pushed some value here to this array. So friends.push, which, remember, will add a value to the end of the array. So if we added 23, and then if we checked for 23 the string, it would not work. So it would say false, right? And that's because it is testing with strict equality, which means that it does not do type coercion. And since 23 the string is different from 23 the number, it gives us false. But if I test it directly for the number, then it should be true. And yes, it is. So we added it here to the array, and so then, of course, the array includes it. That makes sense. And so we can use the includes method to write conditionals. So that's one of the very useful applications of this method. For example, just to test it out very quickly, let's say friends.includes Peter. And then, if so, we can log to the console, you have a friend called Peter. Okay? So we already know that this here returns a Boolean, and we also already know how the if statement works. And so only if this is true, so if the array does include a string with Peter, only then this code is executed. And so right now, of course, nothing happens. But if I ask for Stephen, then here let's say Stephen as well, then I get, you have a friend called Stephen. So that's probably the most used case of the includes method. All right, and that's all I had to show you for this lecture. And as I said in the beginning, there are many more useful methods for manipulating arrays. But for now, I just wanted to show you the most basic ones. And next up, there's yet another coding challenge waiting for you. All right, here goes coding challenge number 2, which is going to be all about arrays. And in this one, we're going to go back to the tip calculator that we built in the previous section. And we're still using the same rules as before. So we tip 15% of the bill value if it's between 50 and 300. And if the value is different, so outside of this range, the tip is 20%. And so here are your tasks. First, write a function called callTip, which takes any bill value as an input and returns the corresponding tip. And so that's going to be based on the rules that I just mentioned. And to do this, you can actually check out the code from the first tip calculator challenge that we did in the last section. So you can copy the code there, or if you want, you can also code this from scratch just to remember how to do it. And now in number 2, we're finally going to use arrays. So here we're going to create an array called builds, which will contain the test data that we have down here. So these are the 3 bill values for which we want to calculate the tips. And so that's what we do in point number 3. So here we create an array called tips, which will contain the tip value for each of the 3 builds. And this is where we're going to use the calc tip function that we created before. So that's the basic challenge. And if you want to take it one step further, you can even take the bonus question, so number 4 here, in which I ask you to create an array called total, which will have the total values. So that's the bill plus the tip. So I hope this one isn't too hard. Basically, it's similar to one of the examples actually that we did in one of the lectures about the arrays. And once again, I also have a hint to help you solving this one. But if you want to try it on your own without the hint, then pause the video now and good luck. But if you want the hint, well, then here it goes. So remember that an array needs a value in each position. But that value can actually be the returned value of a function. So as an array value, you can basically just call a function. All right. And again, that is similar to something that we did in one of the array lectures. So pause the video now, and I see you with my solution in a second. Okay. And I'm going to start by creating the calc tip function. And I'm going to start doing it with a function expression. So this one will receive a bill as an input, I think. Yeah, so calc tip takes any bill as an input. So let's simply call it bill. And then what we want to return is the tip. And here I'm going to write the exact same code as we did in the other challenge. So there's no need to explain it all again. It would just be a waste of time. So if the bill value is between 50 and 300, so less or equal than 300, and here we're using the ternary operator, then return the bill value times 0.15, so that's 15%, and otherwise it should be 20%. Okay? So the result of this ternary operator here will be one of these values. So either bill times 0.15 or times 0.2. And so that's going to be the result of this operator. And so that's what this function will return. If you prefer the arrow function, we can also do that. So const calc tip equal bill. And now we can omit the return keyword and do it all in one nice line. So now you just have to choose which one you like better. And I will just, for the sake of readability, keep the first one there. Okay? But if you prefer the arrow function, you can just use this one. Great. So number 2 is to simply create a builds array with these 3 values. So builds 125, 555, and 44. So that was easy. And now we will create an array tips, which will contain the tip value for each bill. So let's do that. And now this is similar to what we did previously with calculating the ages. So we are going to create an array, and then each position will be the function call to calc tip. So we want to calc the tip with builds at position 0. Then at position 1, we want to calculate builds or we actually want to calculate tips based on builds on position 1 and then on position 2. And that's it. So let's log both the builds and the tips to the console here. And that gives us tips is not defined. So here it should be tips. So usually when I have an array, I like to give it a plural name, like here builds and here tips. So because it's multiple values. So now that should work. And yeah, so these were the 3 tips that were calculated. And of course, you could have created separate values or actually separate variables for each of these function calls, like tip1 equals calc tip with builds 0, something like this, and then tip2 and tip3, and then you could have created like an array with tip1, tip2, and tip3. Okay, so something like this. But my idea was to actually do it like this, because then we don't have to create all these extra variables. So that's a lot cleaner. Later on in the section, we will find an even better way of doing this. But with what we know at this point, this is the best that we can do. So we take the first bill, calculate the tip based on that, and put it in position number 0. Then we take builds at position number 1, calculate the tip, and put it in position 1 of this new array. And then we take builds at position number 2, calculate the tip, and put it at position 2 of the new array. And so then, yeah, we end up with this. Lastly, let's also complete the bonus question number 4 here. And all we have to do here is to create an array which will have the sum of the builds and the tips. So that's going to be totals. And now you might have tried to do something like this. So like builds plus tips. But as I told you in the previous lecture, this is simply not going to work. So we cannot do any operations on arrays like this. It doesn't work like that. So let me show you the result that we would get from doing this. And so basically, each of the arrays would be transformed to a string, and then the 2 strings would be concatenated. So that's completely useless. And so the only thing that we could do is to say that we want builds at position 0 plus the tips at position 0. And now we do this for all the 3 values. So at position 1 as well, and then at position 2. And so this fixes this error, because now in each position we do actually have a real value, because this is an actual value, and so with that we can then do calculations. So yeah, this is correct, looks correct, right? And yeah, so with that, all of the 4 points are solved. And so here we conclude this part about arrays. So after arrays, it's now time to learn about another data structure in JavaScript, which is objects. So up until this point, we have been using arrays as a data structure to basically store multiple related values in the same variable. So let's just quickly recap that. So Jonas array, and you don't need to write this code. Okay, I'm really just trying to recap here. So we had the first name, and you see that I'm writing this in multiple lines now, and that is perfectly acceptable. So sometimes that's easier to give us an overview of a data structure, as long as we remember the commas here after each of the elements, we're going to be fine. So then we have kind of this age calculation here. Then we had the job and even an array of friends. So we have an array inside an array. So Michael, Peter, and Stephen. So again, this is basically a data structure which combines multiple values which all belong to this Jonas entity. Now we know intuitively that this first element here of the array should be called the first name. And this one is the last name. This one could be called age. This one could be called job. And this one could be called the friends. But in arrays, there's no way of giving these elements a name. And so we can't reference them by a name, but only by their order number in which they appear in the array. And so to solve that problem, we have another data structure in JavaScript, which is objects. So in objects, we actually define key value pairs. And so then we can give each of these values here a name. So let's see how. So again, we're defining a variable. And so I'm calling this one Jonas now. And then this is the actual object. So now instead of the square brackets that we use for arrays, we use the curly brackets or curly braces. So this is the second time we're seeing the curly braces. First, we saw them to define a code block, for example, in an if-else statement or if a switch statement, or even to define a function body. But this is different. Okay, so these curly braces here are to define a new object. And so let's now fill up this object with key value pairs. So the key is basically the variable name. So let's say first name, then a colon, and then the value. And the value can be of any type that we want here. Then to define another key value pair, we just separate them with commas, just like in the array. So last name, and then colon, remember, Schmettmann, then the age, and once more, we can put any expression here. So this will be calculated and then will be assigned to age. Then the job, which is teacher, and finally the friends. And let's just copy this array from here. Okay, and so with this, we have now an object which contains 5 key value pairs. So again, these are the 5 keys, and then each key has a value. And so essentially with this, we were able to assign a name to each of these values that we had. So that's something that was impossible in arrays, but now it is possible. Now each of these keys is also called a property. So we say that this object here, so this object, which is called Jonas, has 5 properties. So property first name with the value of Jonas, property last name with the value of Schmettmann, and so on and so forth. Now, objects are probably the most fundamental concept in the whole JavaScript language. So there are many ways of creating objects. And simply writing an object in the code like this is probably the simplest way of creating an object. So here with the curly braces. So there are multiple ways of creating objects, but again, using the curly braces like this is the easiest one, and it's called the object literal syntax, because we are literally writing down the entire object content. So to recap, just like arrays, we use objects to essentially group together different variables that really belong together, such as the properties of Jonas that we've been working with. Now, the big difference between objects and arrays is that in objects, the order of these values does not matter at all when we want to retrieve them. And that's important to keep in mind. So in arrays, the order in which we specify the elements matters a lot, because that's how we access these elements, right? So we can only access array elements using their order number. This means that we should use arrays for more ordered data and objects for more unstructured data, and data that we actually want to name and then retrieve from the object based on that name. But how do we actually do that? So how do we get data from an object? And that's exactly what the next lecture is about. So see you there in a second. In this video, you're gonna learn how to retrieve data from objects and also how to change data in objects using both the dot and the bracket notation. So let's actually get the object here from the previous lecture. So that's Jonas object. And I noticed that we actually didn't even take a look at it in the console. So let's quickly log it. But we're actually not gonna see a big surprise. So all it shows us is really this same object that we just wrote in code. So it looks like this. So essentially just as it is here in the code. The only thing that's different is that the properties here are ordered alphabetically. And so that's what I mean when I said in the last lecture that the order of properties does not matter. And that's because we simply get the properties from the object using the property name itself. So that's actually the topic of this video. And so let me show you the two ways in which we do that. So the first way of getting a property from an object is by using the dot notation. And that is very straightforward. So let's log that to console. And so let's say that we want to get the last name. So all we have to do is to write Jonas dot last name. And that's it. You see, here is my last name coming straight from the Jonas object. So Jonas dot last name. And this dot here is actually an operator which will go to this object and then retrieve the property with the name that we specified here. Now we can do the exact same thing using the brackets notation. So let me show that as well. So Jonas, and then we use brackets in a similar way in which we retrieve data from an array, but here we need to specify a string with the property name, so with the key. So let's do my name again, or actually last name, and so these results should be exactly the same here. Now the big difference between these two here is that in the bracket notation, here we can actually put any expression that we'd like. So we don't have to explicitly write the string here, but instead we can compute it from some operation. Because remember that an operation is basically an expression. So something that produces a value, and so we can put that here inside the brackets. So let's actually try that. And imagine that we had a variable in which we store the repeating part in first name and last name. So we have name here in both. And so let's store just that inside of a variable. And you will see my point here in a second. This will all make sense, trust me. So name key, and then just name. So again, that's the repeating part in these two property names. And now we can use that variable to get both the first and the last name. So console.log, and then Jonas, brackets. And so now here we can insert the expression. So let's create a string first and concatenate it with name key. And here we could have built this string using a template literal, but in this case, it's not really necessary. So let's just copy this and then also last. So what will happen here is that as JavaScript sees this line of code, it will start by executing this plus operation, and so it will create the string first name. And then it will go to the Jonas object and retrieve that property. And the same for the last name here in the second line of code. And so that's how we get Jonas and Schmettmann. And doing something like this is more common than you might think. And so that's why it's important that we understand that in the square brackets, we could put any expression here. Okay? Now the same thing would not work with the dot operator or the dot notation. So we cannot write Jonas dot and then this here, for example. This would not work at all. So, an unexpected string. And so that's the reason why we need the brackets notation. In dot notation, we have to use the real final property name and not a computed property name. So, for example, this one. This one is a real property name as it appears in the object. And so that's why it works here in this case. So, in what situations should we use the dot notation, and when do we have to use the brackets notation? And I kind of already replied to that, but this is just to recap. So when we need to first compute the property name like we did here with the first and last name, then of course we have to use the bracket notation. In any other case, just use the dot notation, which looks a lot cleaner and is also easier to use. Okay? And now to make the need for the bracket notation even more clear, let me show you another example, which I think is going to be really fun. So let's say that we don't know yet which property we want to show. And instead we get this information from some user interface. So for that we can use the prompt function, remember? So we can use prompt, and prompt is yet another built-in function that is built into JavaScript and that we can use in any script. So here we can write a string, and then this will create a pop-up window with an input field, remember? So here we can write, what do you want to know about Jonas? Choose between first name, last name, age, job, and friends. And remember that this function will then return a string, and this string we just need to store into some variable. So let's call this one interested in. All right. And to start, let's just log this interested in value to the console here, just so we see that it actually works. And so here is the pop-up. And so now we just write one of these options here. So let's say job. And indeed, now here we get job. And so what we want to do now is to basically display the job here in the console, because that's what the user chose. So how will we do that? Can we use the dot notation? So basically, can we do this? Jonas.interested in? Well, let's find out. But I hope that you can guess. And so we get undefined. And this is something new that I didn't explain yet. And so let me tell you now that undefined is what we get when we try to access a property on an object that does not exist. So Jonas does not have a property called interested in, right? And so therefore, the result of trying to access interested in on Jonas is undefined. Now, what we need to do here is, instead of the dot notation, use the brackets notation, because then we can put any expression here, which in this case will be interested in. And so JavaScript will now come here and replace interested in with the actual value of the variable, and then that's the one that will be looked up on the Jonas object. So let's try that again. And now, when I say job, we get the correct result. Great. And I hope that you did understand the big difference between using the dot notation and the bracket notation, and why the bracket notation gave us the correct result. So again, it's because basically this expression that we put here between these brackets will get evaluated. And then this one here is job. Now, of course, we can also pass in something else, so something that is not here. For example, let's try to access the location, and then again we get undefined. And once more, that is because there is not a property called location on the object. So let's actually handle that using some knowledge that we already have. So we know that undefined is a falsy value, right? And so we can use that to our advantage now and create some logic that will print a custom string whenever the user tries to access a property that doesn't exist. So let's do that. And we can say, if Jonas brackets interested in, then log that to the console. So basically this. And again, I'm using now the option and arrow down to move this line. And so if this value exists, then it is a truthy value because it is not undefined. And so any string that is not empty or any number that is not 0 will then trigger this code block here to be executed. Now, if one of these properties was actually empty or 0, we would then go to the else block, but let's not account for that here in this case. Let's say that doesn't happen. All right. So in case that the value does not exist, so for example with location, we then get undefined. And so in this case, Jonas interested in is undefined, which is false. And therefore we would go to the else block. And so let's say something like wrong request. And then we can repeat this sentence here. So let's try that again here. So location, and now we get wrong request. But if we try something that exists, then we get that result. Great. So I think this was a fun little experiment here. And yeah, I hope you liked that. And now that you know how to retrieve elements from an object, let's also learn how to use both the dot and the brackets notation to add new properties to the object. So that's pretty straightforward. So all we have to do is Jonas dot, and now let's actually use location and set it equal to something. So to some value. So I'm located in Portugal. And so that's how we use the dot notation. And then we can also, of course, use the brackets notation just the same. So let's say my Twitter handle here, which is @Jonas Schmettmann with just one N. And you should definitely check that out. And now just to see that it worked, let's log it to the console one final time. And okay, it's asking us for the field name again. But anyway, now we have the location and the Twitter here as well in the object. And of course, here we could put any expression just like before. So it works in the exact same way. All right. And that's how we use the brackets and the dot notation. Now, finally, I have one small challenge for you that you can just do right now here at the end of this video. And so what I want you to do is to write a sentence like this one that I'm going to show you now, but in a dynamic way. So let's just write challenge here. And so I want you to write, Jonas has 3 friends and his best friend is called Michael. So here we suppose that the first friend in the array, so in the friends array, is the best friend. Okay, and for the record, I do have more than 3 friends, but of course here we need to keep it all very simple. So again, I want you to write this sentence, but without hard coding any of these values. So what you need to get from the object is this value, and this value. And this is actually a bit hard, I would say. And so there's absolutely no need for you to nail this. But you can still try it, and maybe you can do some of the parts. One hint that I can give you is that you will need to use multiple dots to get the number of friends. Okay, so that's totally possible. And so take like 5 minutes to try this out now. So pause the video and I'll see you in a second. All right. And so this is how we would do this. So we want to log this to the console, of course. And so we're starting with the name. And this one is probably the most straightforward one. So that's just Jonas.first name. So that is where the name is stored. Then has, and then the number of friends. So the friends are stored in Jonas.friends. Now, do you remember how to get the number of elements in an array? It is by writing the array dot length, right? And so let's do that. So Jonas dot friends, and so this is our array, right? And so on this array, we can now ask for the length. And so basically you can see here that length is also a property that is available on all arrays. So it's a property that we don't define ourselves, but it's automatically available. But now that you know about the dot notation, you can also start to understand that the dot length is just a property that is available on all arrays. And so that's what we're doing here. So again, we have an array, which is this one. And on there, we can simply then request dot length. Okay, let's continue the sentence now. And his best friend is called, and now we need to simply get the first element from the array. And so that's again Jonas.friends. And now remember, we get the first element of an array using square brackets 0. And that's it. So once more, this here is simply an array. And so we learned that to take the first element, we just use square brackets with 0. So in a sense, on arrays, we also have the brackets notation. Okay, so let's just test this. And again, this annoying pop-up. But indeed, Jonas has 3, and we're just missing the friends here. So friends, and his best friend is called Michael. So just what I had written here as a template. Now in terms of operator precedence, let's quickly check out why it actually works this way. So with the dots here. Because remember, as I said, the dot operator here is really just that. It's just an operator. And the same goes for the brackets. So I will again Google MDN operator precedence. But the link to this table is also on the resources pages on my website. And the link to that one is right in the first text lecture of the course. But anyway, here we have the dot notation, which here is called member access. And then we have the brackets notation, which is here called computed member access. And so the computed is because, as I mentioned multiple times now, because we can compute the property names that we want to access. Now what matters here is that they both have a really high priority and both are left to right. And so that's why all of this works. So we have 2 dots here. So Jonas.friends.length, and they are executed left to right. And therefore, the first thing that JavaScript does is Jonas.friends. And so essentially, this will then be replaced with the array. And then on that array is where the dot length is then applied. And the same thing here. So first, Jonas.friends is done. And then this one is also left to right. And so from there, we take element number 0. Okay, so there's no magic involved here. There is rules for everything, and everything makes sense. And again, you don't need to memorize this here. With time, all of this will become second nature to you.